congratulations everybody in making it through this weather today to come here. It's going to be a great conversation and well worth your time. My name is Linda Lees. I'm the Director of Cultural Programming for TEFAF New York. I would like to give you a little plug for the rest of the programs in the brochure for the next week, because they're all going to be equally terrific. And it's our first time doing so many on such a varied spectrum of conversations. So I think you'll enjoy all of them. This is live streamed, so it will be going live stream onto Facebook. It will be on Facebook, and then once edited, go onto the website. So all the words of wisdom that drop from the lips of our panel will be situated there whenever you want to go back and see it, or recommend them to others. That would be terrific also. So I'm now going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Bun Hui Tan, who is, in this case, I would say, acting in his role as director of the Asia Society Museum. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks to TEFAF for its vision in opening up the space to basically to non-Western modernity. I'm very happy to welcome all of you here who, as Linda says, you've battled the weather to emerge here. We're not going to do this presentation style, but we're going to try and be a bit more in a kind of debate and conversational format. And first, I'll just like to quickly introduce, right at the end, it's Dr. Zara Jumaboy, Associate Lecturer from the Coteau Institute of Art in London. She is also currently the guest curator and our co-curator for the show The Progressive Revolution, Modern Art for a New India. And second, Siddharth, who is the curator for Indian and South Asian art at the Peabody Essex Museum, and very well dressed, as to note, very appropriate for the occasion. And finally, Priyanka Matthew, who is an art advisor and consultant working in Indian art. So you can see we've carefully curated this to cover all three spheres. And of course, I'm basically a museum curator and not I'm an art critic. I just want to start, we wanted to be a little bit more provocative and start with something that is very obvious, that those of us, even I am guilty when I was initially studying and looking at art and reading the literature, that so much of the literature sort of still assumes that modernity, that modern art is Euro-American. And I just want to read again the review of this exhibition by Jason Farago on September 26th in the New York Times, the opening paragraph. It's worth quoting that again. So I'm quoting Jason here, and he writes, "When I was a student of art history, the textbooks offered a simple, tidy, and wrong history of painting after 1945. The first years after World War II were taught as a clean baton pass from Picasso to Pollock. The New York school led the way. Europe got a brief and sometimes sneering look, and begrudging attention was paid to the avant-gardes of just a few rich non-Western nations, such as the concretists of Brazil and the Gutai artists of Japan. Slowly, too slowly, museums are now taking up the task of rewriting the history of art since 1945 as more than just a triumph of American painting, as the veteran critic Irving Sandler called it." So that is the opening paragraph of the New York Times review of this particular show, which sort of encapsulates a certain kind of expectation that is still very prevalent, and all of us working in this field have had to deal with it. So I want to start by also just briefly saying that the show itself is trying to, one of the things the show tries to do is to deal with it, and one of the ways it deals with it is very particular, is to say that, to make the simple statement that artists in this part of the world, just like artists in other parts of Asia, drew upon many different traditions, not just simply the Euro-American tradition. So I want to start by asking each of our panelists to make a kind of opening statement, a kind of opening pitch about this claim that the Asian modern, specifically the Indian modern, is derivative of the West. If you go to the exhibition, you will see, if you look at the dates carefully, the first sort of stylistic response that comes out frequently is a form of cubism, for instance. You know, that is very, very sort of dominant. You have some other styles, but you see the very strong sort of traces of that. So I'm going to ask that, and I think some of them know, we have notebooks of visitors who write their comments, and one particular American visitor was really interesting. Said, "Beautiful show, you all tried so hard, but it's still derivative." Which is very, very interesting. But this visitor put maximum points for everything. Presentation is beautiful, catalog is beautiful, but he thinks it's still derivative. So let's deal with that. Is the Indian modern really, old wine in new bottles? Is it derivative of the West? Is the work that particularly came up with this sort of group? So I'm going to ask Zara, the art historian and the guest curator and co-curator, to start first. Is it derivative, and why not? Or yes?
Okay, so I'll take your derivative and I'll give you something else. For one thing, I think this is a tired question, and it's almost as if I don't want to have to answer it anymore. And I think Bunhui feels the same way as well. So even to get stuck into a is it derivative argument, to me is a kind of nonsense argument. It's much like saying, is Rothko derivative? So yes, of course he is. And so are all artists derivative? Yeah, they are, because they're inspired by things. And so partly they're inspired by art history, and so they're as derivative as anybody else is. But the reason I said I'll take your derivative and give you something else is because one of my editors came to see the show and listened diligently to all the panels and waved out every time he was sitting in the audience, so I knew he was there.
Editor from where?
We won't go into that. But it's quite a famous American journal, and he said, "I get your point about the derivative, but to me, this isn't really art. You're making a cultural and sociological point. And so these works that you've got up there are very interesting cultural artifacts." And maybe he was just saying that to tweak my tail and persuade me that I need to spend more time fighting with him. But I did think that, that kind of sort of goes beyond even its derivative argument, right? By saying this isn't even art, it's only culturally interesting. And so I said, well, isn't all art cultural artifact? He said, yes, but some more than others. So yes, we'll leave that as it stands, and I'll address directly the issue of art being derivative, and whether it's modern or whether it's Indian or whether it's anything else. Yes, definitely. Indian art is derivative, as much as any art is derivative. Sure it is. But what is it derivative of? So this is a work, and I particularly chose it because it's from the show. It's not immediately obvious to a non-South Asian audience what Krishan Khanna's painting is about. And if I were to probably take a round in the room, you'd probably have a very different interpretations about what it was. And a random journalist came to the press view, and he looked at this painting, and then he started fighting with me after that. And he was like, you mention in this painting all the different influences that this artist might have had within the Indian tradition, but you never said anything about the fact that the title references Rembrandt. So I said, well, yeah, but that's because there are plenty of you to do it for me, so let's have another dialogue. But he was really angry. He just wouldn't let it go. So I thought I'd give you the painting now, and that's the anatomy lesson. And yes, we know it references Rembrandt. Is it derivative? Yeah, of course it is. It's also a quote to the anatomy lesson. But what is it talking about? They're actually generals. And what they're looking at is, if you look at it from a particular angle, it becomes really obvious that it's a truncated map of Bangladesh. And so what is happening in 1971 is actually the second partition of South Asia, of the subcontinent, right? So the anatomy lesson that he's talking about is only at one level an art historical reference. It's also looking at this dark division that is happening for the second time in history. And yeah, so also it's a derivative of a map.
Okay, then move on to Siddharth. And you are also a bit familiar with pre-modern material. So I want to also ask you to say a little bit about, in a sense, this issue of it not being art, but rather a cultural artifact. I think part of that seems to imply that there is this other body of objects produced by culture that are not considered art. So, of course, also the issue of, what came before the modern, is that part of the issue, that people have a certain kind of idea about what is Indian culture and what is Indian art, what is an object of art in India, and is it colored by our sort of immersion in the pre-modern material, especially outside the West. And I say this with full disclosure. I mean, in the Asia society, our Indian material is all pre-modern. It literally just ended at the, basically not even before the 19th century.
One of the things that I think is potentially distinctive about modernism in India is, as Zara has talked about before, a common definition of modernism has been a Western movement and a break from the past. But what people, I think especially if you're not connected to South Asia by origin or experience, maybe it's hard to know the rich wellspring of mythology that people know and are familiar with. The bank of names, of figures from mythology, the hundreds of tiny aspects of epics that people know across the subcontinent is ever present in even my life as an American. And Hussein is one of the artists who actually pulls from that vocabulary to comment on the state and the fate of India today. That's one thing I want to say, is that I do see a relationship with mythology and epic, and that's also led to some of the problems today where certain communities claim the myth as their own, rather than really maximize on the power of myth, which is its universal abilities to change and transform. But first of all, when we talk about derivation, we completely ignore that there is a significant difference and a deep connection to an identity. But other than that, I might be a bit harsh in these words. I think when a dominant party, in this case Western art or Western art historians, call something else derivative, it is a way to sort of appropriate the other into its own narcissistic fantasies of grandeur. And it will say, oh, it's good, but it's not what we did. And I personally have no interest in participating in that or perpetuating that vision of things. I also think that in terms of calling things derivative, I'll just share one quick example. It's not exactly the same thing, but I think we all do it. So I was in Dallas for the first time a month ago, and I'd never been there. I saw this city, and I thought, oh, it's just like Los Angeles. But it's also just like Lawrence, Kansas. And I was doing this thing of trying to place what it was. And essentially, I caught myself because what I was trying to do was master it, claim it, understand it, rather than allow for it to show itself to me, to share with me what created that city that has of experiences that I have never experienced myself. So I think as soon as we do that kind of polarizing, divisive language, that's really a point to step back and check yourself.
But isn't, I mean, that sort of strategy, in a sense, is also, in a sense, trying to understand something that maybe have fundamental differences with your own experience, but trying to recast it in, you know, your own sort of life world, your
Absolutely.
own conceptual form, right?
Yeah, and with that, I would just say, in brief, I am Indian and American, and on a very surface level, sometimes it's very helpful to try to separate what is the Indian part and what is the Western part. At a certain point, it's really irrelevant if I really want to do the deep work on myself, because I am a confluence of both of those things and so many other experiences and things I've been exposed to. So on a surface level, yes, it can be helpful, but if you really want to do deep work, if you're really going to be an art critic who knows art, you're not going to step back on that silly, really 101 way of viewing art.
And of course, something that Zara said before, which actually there have been some projects in New York that have tackled with that part of that kind of what seems a kind of very basic, maybe even willful sort of way of looking at the other also requires a certain kind of forgetfulness or amnesia to, in a sense, the non-Western sources of Western modernity, you know. So I'm reminded of like the project at the Guggenheim, the Third Mind, for instance, and numerous other projects. And of course, you know, Zara also writes about how, you know, even the European modernists, the Impressionists, were looking at certain sort of cultures, but it requires a kind of strategy of looking at it, but you must also forget it. You have a kind of amnesia about it, you know, which is a kind of very interesting kind of move. And so we go to Priyanka. Priyanka is a sort of art consultant, and I notice you've chosen particularly a kind of image that is sort of like almost saying like, come, you know, let's have this conversation. Okay, so let's see. So this is Yellow Kite. Yeah, you.
So, you know, great. I want to have this conversation through the art. And this is a painting that I've been fascinated by and studied quite deeply. So this is M.F. Hussein's Yellow Kite. And I chose Hussein as well because I think, you know, out of all the modernists, to me, many of the artists chose to go and stay abroad and engage and create art outside of the country. He was the face of modernism in India and really was probably the only one who actually came back and created in India art for the new nation. And so Yellow Kite was painted in 1953. It was a painting, Hussein was a prolific painter, and it was painted in 1954. In 1953, this is about 5 years after independence, he takes his first trip to Europe, and there he is confronted with the art of Picasso. He speaks of an affinity to the Fauvists. He was particularly influenced and fascinated, like many Indian painters, by the intellectual art of Paul Klee. And prior to that, you see such a marked shift in 1953 and 54. Prior to that, if you look at his paintings, they were so incredibly influenced by tribal art, and you know the figures were very much. It was the colors and the figures and the structure of his line. Was very much, you could feel the indigenous influences sort of overpowering the structure of his art. And then he comes back from this first very sort of enriching trip to Europe. Now, you know, we were at the Asia Society earlier, and we were lucky, Bonui, to hear a lecture by Homi Bhabha about sort of delving, all of us. I mean, first of all, we have to give great thanks to Bonui and Zara and the Asia Society for putting up this exhibition, because it allows us all to revisit the art, revisit the time, revisit modernism in non-Western sort of spheres. Homi Bhabha concluded his lecture saying something so poignant that really moved me. He said, this was art that was created in the duality of empire and independence, the moment between those two really large sort of experiences. And so Yellow Kite, again, was the first painting one of the first paintings he paints after his return from Europe. All the modernists, the progressives, were going to Europe because they wanted to, in a sense, develop art for a new India. You imagine this very Nehruvian atmosphere right after independence, where science, culture, business, everybody's trying to find new identities, and so were the artists. They were trying to figure out what they wanted to speak about and paint about. And every art movement, in a sense, has been sort of a rejection and embrace of the previous one. I mean, this is not outside of what happens in art histories. It's sort of an amalgamation of a number of experiences that the artists are living in those socio-political moments. And so, for me, I'm fascinated by this painting because he continues to carry with him, the subject matter is very Indian. I've obviously put an image. He grew up in Badarbagh, which is this community in Bombay, which is working class. And he would have walked, from his little apartment and seen fisherwomen and vegetable sellers on the street. So you see the iconography being very Indian. You see the colors being very Indian. I mean, he was very particularly fascinated by Basholi painting, which is 17th century mountain painting, and the colors used in Basholi are very primary. They're primary reds and primary yellows and primary blues, and yet he renders the image in an obviously cubist manner. It's a simple kind of cubism, and incorporates sort of that kind of, that the Yellow Kite has a face painted on it. And it is, you see Paul Klee's work, and that's the obvious reference there. But it's fascinating to me for this painting because Hussein's a very literal painter. There are very few paintings that he's had that are not, that you don't really, you kind of like, what you see is what you get. Like you see a Mahabharata scene. But this was just one of those paintings which was a marriage of all of these influences, but yet had the enigma and sort of the, kind of poetic, in a sense, monumentality of presence. It's not just because of the image, but of the simple choice of colors, the structures, and but it was also, for me, is such a great example of the reflection of that moment, where it was everything. It wasn't just a rejection of the past. In fact, it was embracing of a lot of cultural traditions, but it was also kind of, in a sense, when you said it really beautifully, looking at Cubism, but not submitting to it, not letting it, it took the influence that it needed to from it, but created a very unique picture.
I think that the timing is quite interesting, that when I first encountered this work, that it was almost like a kind of immediate, spontaneous response after Hussein came back from Europe. And if you keep your eye on the timing, you realize that all across Asia, you have artists who, in that moment of encounter, use, what they saw in Europe as, I think I would describe it really as a moment of inspiration. And again, looking at the timing, if you look at particular artist trajectories, they move away from that, or they assimilated that very quickly. They didn't stay there. It's not as if suddenly, that tradition or that style captured them. I think that's that's very important. You see that in China, you see that with the Bandung school in Indonesia. You know, you had a few years, people like Mokhtar Arpin, and the art rapidly, after 3 years, it changed. They assimilated, you know, the cubism that they had encountered, and it suddenly did not look like this anymore.
Yeah, mastered it in a way. Yeah, I mean, I'm also sort of keen to point out at this point that even the sort of trajectory isn't that simple. For instance, you know, the relationship between developing a kind of national style, always at this point, and I think this is across Asia, the national already has within its ambit a certain aspiration for the international. Hence these artists, when they traveled and when they resettled, like Raza, one of the progressives, goes to Paris in 1950 to stay and to learn, and he becomes then defined as a French painter. Sousa goes to London, and after having many problems, he then becomes a kind of British artist, only to be rejected and to run away to New York, where he's completely rejected. So he probably shouldn't have done that. But the aspiration at this point is that the national allows for the international, because if this new nation is a new nation and it's free, it no longer comes under the subjection of a British Empire, then it should have equal status as other free nations. And I think the tragedy, in a way, of the early moderns is that while they thought like that, and their language develops with that idea in mind, their reception is somewhat different, right? Because the people looking at them, particularly I hate using the word West and the rest, kind of, you know, because the West is so many as well, it's just as plural, but where they relocated, whether it was New York or London or Paris, for those places, they didn't need to even acknowledge their own colonial implications, you know, their own colonial past. And the best way of not acknowledging was not to see these others as in any way the same. So yeah, that was one part of it. But the other part of the national international is that in early independence India, in the 40s particularly, you had three very, very important figures, and they were German Jewish art critics and a collector, Langhammer, Schlesinger, Rudi van Leyden. And they were instrumental in sort of encouraging these artists, harnessing them, showing them what to look at. And one of the things that Schlesinger totally loved was the paintings of Kokoschka. So actually, early Hussein, early Ara, Gade Bakre, you definitely see a kind of Kokoschka-esque style. And even that changes as they go away to different places. So you almost can't make a break and say this is the point at which they were looking towards the West, and this is the point at which they were looking towards India, because that moment is kind of folded into each other. Because just as these three immigrant Jewish intellectuals were making them sort of look at modern painting in Europe, they were also saying, well, look at your own. And there was a very important exhibition that happens in 1948, which starts in 1947, just as Indian independence happens. And it starts at the Royal Academy in Britain. It has a bit of a tragedy because it doesn't know what to call itself, because partition happens, right? And you have India and you have Pakistan, and they were just going to call it, artifacts or sort of art and artifacts from the dominions of India. And they couldn't do that anymore because now there's a Pakistan. So they called it the dominions of the South Asian continent, India and Pakistan. And then, of course, it travels. I don't think it ever goes to the dominion of Pakistan, but it does come to India in a very truncated form. form. And this is where Hussain in 1948 in Delhi sees Gupta sculpture, Bashali painting, and folk art traditions, all Indian. And he goes, well, why are we looking towards the West? And this is as early as 48. These are the three things that I can use to construct something new. And so, yeah, it's exactly right. It's all of these things.
So this idea that I think not just with India, but throughout the Asian modern, particularly the post-colonized world, this idea that what we now refer to as modern art, so to speak, or modern art in Asia, is also a moment in which artists in these various contexts and places were trying to find a way to construct something new that sort of made sense to them. And also I think there was the desire that it also have a kind of international outlook, that it would be translatable. So I think that's why it becomes almost messy, because you have all these things occurring together. Sometimes they collide, sometimes the timings don't mix, certain people go a bit faster, a bit later, sometimes they are mixed. So I think that adds to the richness of the scene. And what I found particularly useful, actually, personally, is if you actually look across Pan-Asia, then you begin to see that it's not such an idiosyncratic kind of thing. If you are just looking from the perspective of Euro-America, then everything looks very exotic and very idiosyncratic itself. But you are talking about, and make a pitch for what the founder of the Asia Society, John D. Rockefeller, said, you are talking about 2/3 of humanity. So what does it mean to say that is very strange? It's an isolated thing. So I want to go back to, since things are so complex, and we are at TEFAF, I want to say, so how does one, I don't want to say collect, but how does one sort of begin to approach this kind of material? This kind of material that is, that can be, that in which, sometimes context is very important. Sometimes, understanding and disentangling all these various sort of ideas that the artists, being the creative but frustratingly creative people, sort of start to absorb. How do you explain? What is the easiest way to explain? Can I ask the person,
I think Priyanka should do that.
who is actually an art advisor, because I'm sure you are faced with that.
I actually would say doing it directly. I mean, there is no, to put the art in a box and trying and argue that you should collect it because of the context is very difficult to do. I mean, as somebody who loves art, and I went into this profession, I love art because I respond to it. It's a very personal connection. It's a very sort of intimate thing that happens. Now, and almost always, when you're confronted with a painting or you're confronted with a work of art, you will have a reaction. It might be disdain, it might be engagement, and then, I always say, as an art advisor, what I do is I bring this sort of second level of vetting. When you look at a work and you love it, the context I will bring, because I have the 16 years of handling this material, and I could give you the context if that's what you need to sort of feel secure to acquire it. But really, the first step is to respond to it, and to for me, a successful work of art is something that makes me think differently, think a new thought. That's when it's inspiring, and that's when I remember it. And there's a certain sort of energetic response that you have to it. And I think it's probably the reason why most of the art is collected either by South Asians, or there are incredible, like John D. Rockefeller collected a lot of it. He did collect modern. And the few people who are Western and non-South Asian collectors of modern Indian and modern Indian really are people who spend time in the country. So that sort of connection is Masanori, for example, is a very big Japanese collector, or whether it's Chip and Cheryl Kay, who are they've had some connection to India. So I would just say that as the world is getting more fascinated and interested in histories outside of the Western context, the curiosity about the art is going to naturally increase, because it's really within the art that you get clues of the experience and sort of information about these geographies. And so it's going to be a process. I don't think you can shove it down somebody's throat, but I think exhibitions like the Asia Society is having right now is giving you at least the opportunity to respond. You haven't had that before. Where do you go and see modern South Asian art? So step one, thank you, Banui. But it's a difficult question. I don't know. I think that's the best way I could answer it.
Yes, that's why you are here. It's a very difficult question. Zara, Siddharth, you have anything?
Yeah, I would just say I love art. I love lots of art. I don't love all art. And in my position where I'm curating a large collection, I don't love all of it, but it's literally my job to find a way in. Like, I am not the be-all, end-all of what is good art and what is bad art. And so it's literally my job and responsibility to find a way in, to keep looking. And I do have a kind of psychoanalytic slant in everything I do. And I think that when there is a negative response to something, I have an opportunity to look deeper. Because in the same way that you say it can educate us about the different geographies, I also feel that art can educate us about ourselves. And if there's something I'm responding to negatively in a work, there might be a mirror that the work is presenting, an opportunity to look into a mirror and understand oneself better. So if I don't respond to something, sometimes I do just definitely not that. But other times it's a great challenge and an experiment to look deeper.
I was actually going to ask Siddharth for a little story, which I do sometimes. But on the Peabody Essex Museum, which is in Salem, right? And it's a huge and amazing collection built up mostly by Davida and the Hurwitzes. And I wondered, as a Chester, sorry. And I wondered if you could actually give us a little bit of context about that as an example of one kind of a major American institution that comes out of a fascination with a completely different culture for them at the beginning.
For sure. Okay, so, and I'm going to start by pointing something out, which is that the Peabody Essex Museum, and in terms of South Asian art, it is largely understood and represented by the Chester and Davida Hurwitz collection, but there are others, and that collection makes up a significant and well-known part, but there are all these other collections that existed before. And so part of my duty is to create the continuity that I see there. The Peabody Essex Museum is the oldest continually running museum in the United States, and the first boats that were going to India directly from America after independence were coming and going from Salem and bringing these objects back from India. So I just wanted to share that as well, is to blow it bigger than the Hurwitz collection. And yet, the Hurwitz collection is a great treasure that we have. And it started with a couple. He was a designer, making handbags. I think he started going to collect, do leather working, get leather products, and took an interest in the art. And they pretty quickly tapped into communities of artists. They were traveling all over the country and picking up things everywhere. It became quite, just like, when I used to sell art, we would call a coconut. Is when they come in and they just want to buy everything. So they really developed wonderful relationships with the artists as well. And that's one of the things that's unique, I would say, about the Hurwitz collection, is not only do we have the objects, but we have the archive, which is all of these letters, correspondence between artists and this American couple, menu cards with sketches by different artists that really show us the intimacy that they had with the artists. But I would say, again, it was a couple that had some connection with India, then some experience of it, and they liked what they saw.
So I think the other sort of I won't say approach. The other reason is that I think at this moment in time, what art needs to also help us do is to help us understand difference. I think that's very, very important. I mean, one of the big challenges of our time and the call on art is that we are beginning to have sometimes very little tolerance for differences, for other ways of living, and art is in a sense a safe way to enter this kind of interrogation, this kind of exploration. So hence, that kind of attitude, I think, is very important when you approach art that comes from other traditions, irregardless of which is the tradition that you're more familiar with. I'm conscious of the time, so I want to quickly open the floor up for questions. Linda has a mic, so if you just flag your hand, we'll pass you the mic. They can't wait for provocative questions, so please fight away.
I'm gonna bring in a dirty subject, which is the market.
Okay.
Because we should look at that context too, and one of the things about modernist Indian art, when you look at regional markets, regional sort of, if you compare it to Latin American art, if you compare it to Chinese art, Southeast Asian art, very simply, the top price now in China for a Zhaoqi is $64 million. The top price in Latin America will be somewhere between 12 and 13. The top price in Southeast Asia is 16.5 million. The top price of art generally is 450 million. The world record price for the top Indian painting is 4.5 million.
Wow, you did your math.
And but you also look at then the macro factors in that it's a very wealthy country. It's has a very wealthy diaspora, and that is going to correct itself in time. So get in early.
Conundrum. The gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to the lady in the front.
Hi,
No, that was great. Yeah.
I guess carrying off from that point, I was wondering if the four of you could speak maybe a little bit about thinking how to collect in this category responsibly for somebody who isn't from South Asia, and what that might look like.
Of course, you have to start first.
One of the things that I've noticed, and I've worked with collectors who, were collecting at the time of the Hurwitzes and have equally great collections, and then collectors who, a Japanese collector who's amassed an amazing collection of modern Indian art. And I always find and then there's, Keto and Jane de Boer who have an amazing collection. I always find that the starting point is a personal response. You really have to start with the individuality of the collector and what their sense and framework is, and then it's, so Masanori, for example, went to India, and I think he had an Indian girlfriend at the time. I'm not sure I'm supposed to share the story, but then, went into a studio and saw work of art and really loved it, and there's a different experience there. So I really think that the starting point has to be, you have to put the art in front of the collector and then think about, what his context is and what he would like to take away from it. And then from there, maybe you perhaps build a historical collection. I mean, there's art available from 1947, the early 40s is when really I think the first modernist kind of art developed. right up until the 70s and the 80s. And, you could do it that way. You could do it through an artist. There's so many number of ways to do it. It's actually, if you get into the material, there are a myriad of very creative ways to build wonderful collections that can be meaningful and can be, sort of gifts to generations down the line if they're institutionalized.
Any response from?
Yeah, I mean, being an art historian and associate lecturer at the court also, and now this is like my first curated show, I sort of don't talk money usually, and so I almost act like collectors don't exist, which is very stupid, because yes, they do, and actually, particularly in a market where there really isn't institutional collecting. It's all about private collecting, which actually leaves a huge onus on individual and private collections. So that, I mean, I know from my own experience that the course that I teach would frankly not be possible if I didn't have a really good friend who opened his house out as if it were a museum to my students. And it's a really, really rich collection. He started with modern Pakistani art, he moved to modern Indian art, he now collects contemporary art, and he's even started looking at miniatures. And it all started because he had a best friend who forced him to buy one thing. And by now, he said he was way fed up of that first thing because he didn't listen to her, and he said, no, I like that. And he says his own collecting style has evolved. But the truth is that at this point in time, there's certain markets and there's certain economies and there's certain countries where collecting is more than just what it is you like. It's almost like a responsibility, because what you are and what you have the potential to be is a little museum, is a little way of thinking about a culture, or more than one.
And I'll also just touch on that as well. So I come from a selling background. I worked in galleries for about 4 years. I was a director for a year and a half or 2 years, and then I had my own business of selling art for about 11 years. And I dealt in Nepalese, Hindu, and Buddhist art. And I would simply tell people to buy what they loved. I did not deal with kind of building collections. I had a very different approach to it. And what Zara says is completely true. Now being in a museum and seeing that, these are individuals who are collecting this work, we need people to purchase and acquire strategically for themselves, but also to support our missions and our aims. But I would never be the right consultant for that, because I'd go back to my psycho and, well, if you see yourself in it and you've got the money, you should buy it.
I think this idea of collecting what you like is quite important, or rather, to be more precise, work that you have an emotive response to. I don't use the word emotional, but emotive response. But one thing that I've always said is that if you take a kind of broader approach, there is a kind of moment now, because also that across many parts of Asia, the institutional infrastructure for building systematic national collections of modern and contemporary art is very underdeveloped. I think if that is the background, there is a certain kind of responsibility on private collecting. And one idea I'm always very fascinated with, and I've spoken to quite a few collectors, is that there is a kind of moment that almost seems a kind of, I wouldn't say need, a kind of stimulus, that it might be interesting to look at moments of Asian modernity across the Asian continent. So one can either collect in depth, or there's nothing wrong also collecting, across. So you are collecting as a sort of comparative, for a comparative purpose, and it might be very interesting as well. So that's also a kind of possibility, because there is a moment, if you look at South Asia even China, Japan, Korea, you know, I mean, all this hot thing about the Korean monochrome only came very recently. And even in such a developed scene as Korea, many of the post-war sort of styles have not had any dent or any knowledge outside Korea, even in Korea, like for example, you know, how many of you have really seen the post-war, the hyperrealist in Korea? You know, if you think the Americans are fantastic, wait till you see the Korean hyperrealists, which only came at a very specific point in time. So there are many endless things to collect that would be very interesting. So I think the lady.
Sorry, yeah, I actually had a question that went back to what you had mentioned, Priyanka. So one, you know, what appeals to me a lot is art that women have created in South Asia. But when I look at the pricing and the collecting, people just, I mean, the pricing just lags behind like crazy. And so what is it about that? Is it that the art that women are creating is not appealing to people, or what? I just wanted to have that discussion.
Okay, I don't get that. Like, I mean, what? You mean modern art?
Modern art, yeah.
But,
If you look at the prices just alone.
yeah, but if you look at contemporary art, I mean, particularly within South Asia, then most of the really successful artists are women. So let's. Really? You think Nalini sells for less than an Atul Dodia? How is that? What price? Yeah, but I mean that I really don't think that that's a thing with contemporary art. With moderns, I would agree with you, but there were very few women who actually had the opportunity of being artists. I mean, even somebody like Banu decided, you know, the way forward was to do fashion design for the movies. And she was a lot more successful much more quickly. So yes, with the modernists, but this question.
I think that question needs like 5 PhDs because it's not, I don't think it's specific to any culture. Yeah, I think there is in the market, there is generally a kind of gender bifurcation. There are many exceptions, but there is generally, if you look at that level, but the reasons and the ways in which that is manifested, I think, are very specific. And very
I
complex.
genuinely
And
think that it's
are,
also, this is just a too sexy question. You know, it's possible to overstate a case where, for instance, contemporary Pakistani art, 90% dominated by the women, and they're better artists. It is true. Shazia Sikandar versus Imran, no-brainer. Actually, Shazia is going to stay the line because she is frankly a more inventive artist. She's also based in New York. So there are also other factors. I mean, I think particularly at the moment, we can make too much of the gender case.
So in South Asia, I mean, I know that relatively speaking, there are more female artists. Sorry. Yeah. In one of the reasons, very brief, yeah. So one of the things that just bothers me is that there are a lot of women artists, but if you actually go just down the line and actually look at the pricing for the women compared to the men, there's a big difference overall. And there are exceptions like Shazia, I totally agree with you. So it's just, just a thought.
I think there's not a simple answer to this, but that parity exists everywhere in all industries, be the financial world or the auction world or academia, and that parity is shrinking. So we're in the right direction. Contemporary is in a good place. Modern may not, between the genders. And I think, it's exactly that. I mean, in the modernist area, we don't have any female artists that we have examples of in our show. I feel like saying our show. Collective hour.
And I actually did find when I was doing research for the show that there was one modern Indian artist who was female, Banu Ataya, and I refer to her a lot in my curatorial essay, the sort of finding out who she was. And I met her daughter this time when I was in Bombay and actually looked at the work, and it was very, very comparable to what Gaitonde was doing at the time, to what Hussein was doing at the time, to what Ara was doing. But she never moved from there for the simple reason that she actually says that she doesn't think it was, she she didn't want to be an artist anymore. They were all going to starve in a garret, and as far as she was concerned, she had other options. She was very, very talented, and she then won the Oscar. In 1981, she became the first Indian per se to win an Oscar. 1982, sorry, for Gandhi. And that was our one signature Indian woman artist who decided that she didn't want to be an artist. So yeah.
Can we make a
Yeah.
must
So now
reference?
we
must reference Amrita
Close.
Shergill. We must reference her because she
Do
was.
we have to?
We do, because she was. Hussein calls her. Hussein looked upon her work a lot, and she was avant-garde for her
Definitive.
time, and exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
in a
Completely,
sense,
yeah.
half Hungarian, half Indian, like Frida was.
Yeah.
Half Mexican and half.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, and I will say I'm the only person on this panel that actually has a different view of Amrita Shergill, and I'm very infamous for saying that, including having an argument
another
at the
panel.
vernissage, but that's another panel. So I think we have to end, right, yeah, because TEFAF is very on the dot. And so...
But talking about gender parity, one last thing.
Yes.
Possibly the most important voice in contemporary and modern Indian art is Geeta Kapoor, a woman.
So we're going to end the session. Thank you all for coming, and can we thank all our panelists today? Thank you. And give it back to Linda.
Moderator's prerogative. Thank you all so very much for coming. Please come back and see us. We have 8 more programs. So please have a look at your brochure, and thank you so much for coming out today. Another hand for a wonderful panel. Thank you.